When you think of elves, goblins, orcs, and things of that nature, you typically think of them existing in the far past in ancient medieval fantasy like times. But what if there was a planet, a world out there that you could travel to through space on perhaps a massive world ship of sorts, where all these beings, all these different types of creatures and fantasy races actually existed. So, what we're going to be talking about today is a little world map I made. Nothing too special, but it's part of a wider project I'm working on about a planet that was basically colonized by humans at one point in history as they travel across the stars finding new homes to live on. And we're going to go a little bit into the lore about this planet, but before we do that, we got to talk about what brought humanity to this planet. So, obviously, in this fictional universe, alternate timeline of sorts, humanity starts on Earth, but then Earth over time gets used up and gets taken by a massive global empire, and then people start to leave to find new planets to form new homes on. And over time, these massive world ships are constructed, which a world ship is basically just a big spaceship that a lot of people live on for a really long time, sometimes for multiple generations, until they find a new planet that is suitable for human life. And that's what they do in this universe. They build these ships and they travel throughout the universe. And eventually, one of these ships, running low on fuel on its destination to a habitable world, just barely manages to make it to the planet it was planning to go to. And that planet is known to it was named Vial 01 was the name of the planet. At least that's what they called it until they got there and found out that there were already civilizations living on this planet that had their own different names for the planet, of which there were multiple different civilizations that were, for the most part, warring with each other when humans first arrived. And as you can imagine, humans kind of made it worse. For a little while, anyway. So when the world ship that the humans used to get to planet Vial 1 crashed, it crashed onto a continent that at the time was an unnamed continent. Yes, there were a pre-existing civilizations on this continent, but none of them had fully explored it. And it wasn't the most habitable of continents. It was not really a wasteland at the time, but it didn't have enough resources for the people living on it to really expand out until this human world ship crashed onto their continent, which ended up being named after the world ship. So the world ship was literally just designated as world ship D01. And this world ship D01 would be misinterpreted by the locals as being called Dole because they didn't really understand the lettering on the sides of the ship. They thought in their mind that DO1 actually meant Dole, and the way they pronounced it was kind of weird at first, but the humans on board kind of went with it for a while because some of the existing civilizations on this planet, some of them thought the humans were like a space-faring civilization, which technically they were. Others thought it was like gods or angels coming from the sky, and still others thought it was more along the lines of a threat, like an invasion force. So no one really knew for sure what to think of the human world ship that crashed into the Dole Wasteland, as it would later become known. And while it wasn't a true wasteland when it first crashed, I mean, there used to be trees and life there, but the ship was so large, when it crashed, whatever was left on Dole, as far as like not wasteland stuff, right? Like the big forest and stuff would catch fire from the engines of the ship, and most of the island, or sorry, not the island, the continent of Dole would pretty much be ravaged by the debris of the ship. In the process of this, we ended up with the junk field, which is a whole bunch of leftover scrap from the ship. The roads, the city of Dole, various fortresses and whatnot across the continent of the Dole Wasteland, as it would later become known. Almost everything started to be built out of the remains of that ship, because that's all they had to work with at that point. But before this ship had ever even landed, or rather crashed into the Dole Wasteland, which, as mentioned, it pretty much created the wasteland, for all intents and purposes. Before it had arrived, and it was on its way at the time. See, world ships can take a long time to get to the planet you want to get to. In fact, multiple generations had lived and died on this ship before it got there. And in the time it was traveling from Earth to planet Vial 1, what we ended up getting was there were two major settlements, major cities in the Dole Wasteland, again, before it was truly a wasteland. Back when the continent didn't really have its own name. It was just two major cities, one on either side of the island, and some smaller towns here and there. So there used to be a island that was populated by a race of people that looked a lot like fantasy elves, like the high elves of fantasy, and they would later be called that by the humans when the humans arrived, believing that these people really were elves, because that's basically what they amounted to, that they looked like elves from fantasy. They looked like all these different, like, they looked like fantasy elves. They didn't look like Santa's elves. They looked like fantasy elves, so they got referred to as that. And they were in basically a constant war with another city on the Dole Wasteland, again, before it was truly a wasteland. And there was a city populated by a race of people that heavily resembled vampires of fantasy. Now, unlike the vampires that humans usually think of on Earth, these vampires they looked like humans, but they were vampires, and they weren't related to the humans. They weren't related to the elves either. They were just their own unique race of people that had vampire fangs and drank a lot of blood. So, but they weren't like evil per se. In fact, at one point in this planet's history, before the world ship had arrived, the High Elves had actually invaded the vampires' capital city and completely destroyed it and slaughtered everyone who lived there except for a few members of the royal family who managed to escape and go into hiding. Because the vampires had their own king and queen, and who had their own children, who the only survivors were three of the children of the king and queen of the vampires, who went into hiding for a long time. And just like people assume vampires on Earth would have like immortality, these vampires aren't necessarily immortal, but they do live for an exceedingly long time, just like the High Elves that lived in the other major city on the Dole Wasteland, again, before it was actually a wasteland. The two factions were always fighting each other up until the High Elves destroyed the vampires' capital city, and then the High Elves' capital city was eventually destroyed, or basically rendered unhospitable, when the world ship, the human world ship D01, D01, which again was why it was later called the Dole Wasteland, because of a miscommunication between the humans and the other races that lived on this continent or island or whatever you want to call it. And when the ship crashed, it scorched all the forests that were on the continent of Dole, or as we now know, the Dole Wasteland, and it left a massive scar on what remained of the High Elves cities. The High Elves civilization was kind of in decline at the point that the world ship was coming down from the sky and crashing, and it destroyed what was left of their city. And then eventually the city of Dole, or the city of the world ship D01, was built among the remains of the ship. And over time, the humans would learn more about the existing elves, and some humans would begin to discover the survivors of the attack on the vampire city, and some people would try to help and protect them, while others would be hostile towards them. But the capital city of vampires only had three survivors who were children of the king and queen of the vampires. But there were other small towns where some vampires managed to escape. So it's not like there were only three survivors in total of their species, of their race, if you know, whatever term you prefer. It's just there weren't many. Some humans would actually side with them and protect them, while others would kind of side with the high elves. So there was a lot of fighting and infighting going on after the world ship crashed into what again became the Dole Wasteland. And if we go north of the Dole Wasteland, we have Grave Island. Grave Island was basically an old pirate island way back when, long before humans ever came to this planet. Back when the vampires and the high elves still had their capital cities and stuff, there were pirates from various different species and races on this world who had set up shop on Grave Island. And it came to be known as Grave Island because it got hit by a massive plague that killed a lot of people. That some believed to have been a supernatural plague of some sort. Eventually, everyone came to the realization that the remains of the world ship D-01 were not enough to sustain civilization for the foreseeable future. So what they had to do is, once they exhausted most of its resources, and then at this point they had already built a seaport, the Dole Seaport as it came to be known, and they started to make use of what they had left to build little ships, and sometimes take old pirate ships off of Grave Island, and they started to sell them across the ocean to the east, as well as some to the south. But when they got to the south, all they found was the dread cold sea, and what the elves referred to as the endless cold lands, which is basically this planet's version of Antarctica. There's not a lot there. There's a little bit of stuff there, but not a lot. There's no civilization there. It's just like Antarctica on Earth. There isn't much there. It's not hospitable, although it does have some mysteries to explore in another video, perhaps. Now, if you're looking at this map here, you can see a lot of the locations are marked. The roads are marked. Major cities are marked. The continents, the islands, stuff like that. And as they sail across the sea, they discovered the Ashburn Island, which is basically just one big volcanic island that's covered in lava and magma and volcanic rock and stuff. It's also pretty much entirely inhospitable, so nobody lives there that anyone knows of. There is a bit of a mystery surrounding it, because as you look at the map, in the middle where the ocean is, I marked out a location called Wreck of the Stingray. So what that is in this universe, and this is something that happens a little bit later, the Stingray was a luxury cruise ship. But unlike regular cruise ships that you think of that, sail on the ocean surface, this was a submarine cruise ship. So basically the way it worked was, and the thing was built a few generations later after the people from the Dole Wasteland traveled across the ocean and started to build cities and settlements on the next continent across the sea from that, where the Empire of New Viola would eventually be established, and we'll get into that later. But I just want to real mention that Wreck of the Stingray, that was a luxury submarine cruise ship, because the waters between the two continents are extremely deep. In all honesty, no one really knows how deep the water is or what's all down there, but there was some later on, again, once they established Empire New Viola, the people living on this planet, humans, elves, and vampires, well, to be fair, like I said, there weren't a lot of vampires left by this point, but it was mostly humans and elves in most of the settlements, and a couple, like, minor species that like integrated into the civilization over time. And at some point, a major company emerged called Greystone. And the Stingray was a luxury cruise ship that was commissioned by a high-ranking official within the Greystone company. Now, Greystone eventually went from just being a seafaring company that just made ships and vehicles, they also make land-based vehicles, to eventually making flying vehicles, where they would eventually build what's called the Greystone Aviation Facility, which is also marked on the map. So the Stingray luxury cruise ship submarine thing, that was one of their ships. And they built surface ships, like surface cruise ships, underwater cruise ships. They built naval vessels, all that stuff. They eventually got powerful enough that they started to build aircraft carriers and spacecraft and launching spacecraft from their own spaceport at their aviation facility, where eventually a new space station will be built orbiting the planet, which was run by the Greystone Company. And they built a couple different smaller space stations, but one major one, which was just called the Greystone Satellite, basically is what they called it. But it was a massive space station where the people, again, who generations ago settled on this planet and started to work with the elves and the other races on the planet to build a new civilization and a new home for humanity. They started to spread out a little bit to some surrounding planets and moons and stuff. Like, for example, the planet Vial 1 has a moon with a moon base that is run by the Greystone Company, as well as there are some civilian establishments and stuff on the moon. The moon for planet Viola 1 doesn't really have its own name either. They just refer to it as a moon, just like we do here on Earth. On their moon, they have everything from, obviously, the Greystone Company's personal space to civilian spaceports and military installations and things like that, as well as early warning systems for potential threats from outer space, because this planet has been invaded numerous times by various warring alien races or armies, space armadas, whatever you want to call them. They have been invaded since then. Now, they were never invaded from outer space before the human world ship crashed. In fact, they weren't actually invaded until they started putting satellites and, more so specifically, their space stations up there. And it was actually a signal sent out from the Greystone satellite, which was the biggest space station they had. They just called it Greystone Satellite because they thought it sounded cool, I guess. But it's really a space station that people lived and worked on. And a signal was accidentally broadcast from it, which attracted a robot army, basically, to attack their planet. It did eventually get fought off. Long story short, the reason the Empire of New Viola is even named that is because of a war hero who was involved in that, who was related to some people, and there's a whole bunch of craziness that happened involved there. Basically, they had like one family came out on top of it all. That's basically how it went down, and they started naming different things after themselves, which is kind of like what you would kind of expect a family that came out of something like that as the most powerful family on the planet to do, using the fame of the war hero that was closely related to them, and also, you know, all the other groups on the planet that would have had the means to establish significant amounts of power were just wiped out by the robot army that attacked. And this was an alien robot army. And it was led by basically a machine that thought it was perfect, and, well, it was pretty darn close to it. It got fended off, it got pushed back, and all its drones were pushed back and everything. but the machine that led that army planned to come back. Now, there would be a second invasion later on where this robot army would return many generations later after a whole nother invasion from what basically the remnants of the Earth Empire would travel across space with more advanced technology they developed that would allow them to reach other worlds that were farther away without the need of traveling in a world ship for multiple generations. So basically the Earth Empire in this case somehow managed to scrape together the technology, and some on planet Violet 1 believe that the Earth Empire got some help from some more advanced alien race of some sort. But the long story short is they got some kind of hyperspeed technology. They could travel through wormholes, all that stuff, to get to Planet Viola or Planet Viola 1 or whatever it was called at whichever point in its existence, because it went under a couple different names. In fact, the family that rised to the most power tried to name it after themselves at one point. So some people call it Planet Viola, some people still call it Planet Viola 1, and there's a couple other names for it. There's a lot of different groups on the planet, and some of them believe it should go by other names. So there is a little bit of like political infighting, even within the major civilization on the planet now, the major empire that controls most of the planet. Even some of the more powerful figures within that empire don't agree on things like the planet's actual name, among other things. So it's not the most well-functioning government. I mean, not that there's a government that ever functioned that well when you think of it, even in real life, but you get the idea. It's not the worst functioning government you could think of, but it's also not the best. But they did manage to fend off the Earth Empire's invasion fleet for a time and reestablish peace on their planet, or relative peace. And then, yeah, like I said, a few generations after that, that robot army returned to take advantage of the weakened state of the empire on planet Viola 1, or planet Viola. Again, whichever one you want to call it, either name works. But like I said, within the political structures of this empire, different groups are always arguing about what they could rename the planet, because even though it's an empire and there's one family at the top, there's a lot of other political factions within that empire who want to be at the top, who will do anything in their power, obviously, to overthrow the existing government of their empire, which I guess is kind of true of any empire. You know what I'm saying? But that brings us to a point where on this planet of Viola 1, or Planet Viola, this happens before the Earth Empire invades and after the first invasion of the robot army, the space robot army, or whatever you want to call them. Between those two invasions, the Empire New Viola splits due to a civil war, and it's a brutal civil war, where for most of it, the capital city, Violet City, was mostly safe, and they were using the company, Greystone Company, who had a city named after their company as well, Greystone City, to develop super soldiers via a cloning process. They had a laboratory where they developed all kinds of ridiculously stupid weapons. Greystone, as a company, relied heavily on cloning soldiers and developing the means to create super soldiers, and then cloning those super soldiers, and their weaponry varied. They used a variety of different weapons, but it was mostly whatever advanced technology they could get their hands on, some of which they developed themselves, some of which they got off of the robot army and reverse engineered. They didn't really have a whole lot of like sci-fi laser weapons or anything like that. I mean, like plasma weapons do exist in this universe, but not to the extent, because they're more expensive to manufacture the fuel source for those, or battery source for those, I should say, within this particular universe, given that they run off this like weird crystal energy stuff that can only be obtained from the wreckage of those robots that invaded, as well as some hidden underground facilities where they're trying to replicate the same like fuel source, the same crystal energy thing, basically power crystals. And they're trying to regrow more of those off of the wreckage of the robot soldiers, the robot army that they killed, that had invaded, that they had fended off because they were powered by the same thing. And during the civil war of this planet, or the Empire Civil War, basically you had two sides. You had the actual Empire itself, and you had a rebel group, or at least for the first half of the war, everyone just assumed they were your average rebellion that wanted it to rule over its own area of the planet. And over time, it started to be revealed that this rebel group uh, was being led, or rather misled, by some very bad people. And in particular, it was led by a ex Greystone Company soldier. So basically, Greystone had during the first battle with robots, one of the Greystone soldiers was actually fighting on the moon and against these robots. And when this group of soldiers that were on that moon came back, some of them actually splintered off from Greystone for various reasons, mostly selfish reasons, but for various reasons, um, formed the rebel group, and then started to recruit as many people as they could from all across the planet. But while the first half of the Civil War, they functioned as your typical rebellion fighting for freedom, over time, even they began to splinter up into different little groups because the Civil War was kind of going bad for them, and half of the rebel group ended up resorting to becoming a literal terrorist organization, whereas the other half kind of fizzled out over time and gave up as their leadership resorted more and more to terrorist like activities, ranging from slaughtering of innocent civilians and things of that nature. So it got bad over time. And during this, the leader of that group corrupted some of the crystal stuff that was used, that the crystal technology, like this power crystal technology that they got from the robots that they fought off before, right? And yeah, and corrupted their leadership, corrupted these crystals, and basically summoned a what amounts to a demonic horde invasion, because they basically turned themselves into demonic monsters essentially, and they lost all sense of humanity, and they basically just started slaughtering everyone and everything uncontrollably. Which eventually they were put down, but not until a whole bunch of corruption was discovered within the Greystone Company, which led to massive change in leadership for that company, and them losing pretty much all of their military contracts, and a new royal guard being established that functioned separately from the Greystone Company's military that was previously used by the Empire's government. So basically, at that point, the Greystone Company was now not allowed to serve as a military force for the government anymore, and they now had a royal guard army and stuff like that. But by that point, that part of the war was already over, and the Civil War was pretty much declared over at that point, barring a few like terrorist type attacks that happened afterward. So that's the current state of this fantasy world thing that I'm working on, is basically that they had just fended off the second invasion of the robot forces, the robot forces, army, whatever you want to call them, and they're rebuilding from that. So anything that happens after that, I haven't planned out yet. But at its core, those are my ideas. I have a friend or two that I'm talking to who might want to add a few things to this. But this is at its core what's being worked on. And this map here just kind of shows what the world looks like, what this particular planet looks like at its current stage. Now, obviously, it's made in Microsoft Paint, so it doesn't look that good, but it serves the purpose of showing you where things are. So I'm pretty happy with it. Okay, so I've been rambling on for about half an hour. Let me know what you think of this little world building experiment I did. I don't know what you're gonna think of the story, but I'm thinking of expanding it over time. And yeah, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it because, like, honestly, if anyone got this far in the video, I'm shocked. Yeah, thank you for watching. Maybe see you around the video. Bye for now.